Trade is absolutely fundamental to EU membership. The EU has what's called exclusive competency for negotiating and agreeing trade deals. Not only does it regulate trade within the EU, but it also regulates the trade agreements with countries who are EU members, the agreements they have with countries outside of the EU. Given the UK's decision to leave the EU, what are the policy options facing us for trade? The most important is how are we going to trade with the rest of the EU? The EU accounts for about just less than half of our total trade, and so that's an extremely important arrangement to sort out. Second, what do we do with the very large countries that the EU is currently under negotiation with for future trade agreements? And thirdly, how are we going to set up trade agreements with those countries that already have trade agreements with the EU, but the UK will no longer be covered by? Now, on the whole, taken together, these are fairly small countries, and so this should be somewhat easier, because in many cases one would hope that one could simply roll over or extend the agreements that exist at the moment. In the UK, trade between Liverpool and London, say, is completely free. We can go and live in London or Liverpool, trade goods, sell services. The idea of the single market is we can have the same freedoms between, say, Liverpool and Lisbon. It requires the four fundamental freedoms: free movement of goods, free movement of services, free movement of capital, and free movement of labour. And the EU has made quite clear on several occasions that these are indivisible. Trade in goods, the restrictions are actually quite small around the world. 3% is the average World Trade Organization tariff, pretty small. But services are altogether more complex. They depend on non-tariff barriers and often require the right of establishing a business in another country. We have to agree the single set of rules. And often to consume or to produce services in another country, you need to have the free movement of labour as well. So that's why these four fundamental freedoms are indivisible. They're important to the UK because the UK is the third biggest exporter of services in the world. We're very good at services, and services are the bit where the single market really comes into its own, is really important. And so the challenge for the UK is replicating the benefits that we have in the single market when we're outside of the EU, which the difficulty is, it looks like that's going to require accepting the four freedoms. So that's the nub of where the problem is. Passporting means that any firm based in the UK, which has UK authorization, is allowed to set up, locate itself in any other country in the European Union, and vice versa. So that's how we have free trade in services. 8 out of 10 citizens work in the service sector in the UK. If we're going to continue to enjoy that, to what extent do we have to accept free movement of goods, free movement of services, free movement of capital, and crucially, the free movement of labour? My one piece of advice for the people who are going to be negotiating these trade agreements is to consider what the trade agreements mean back in the UK in terms of what does it mean for domestic policy, because you cannot separate our trade policy from our domestic policy. And too long we've tried to treat them as separate. Trade policy does create inequalities that need to have mitigating domestic policies. Taking the two together mean we can have a much better, more people engaged and more people enjoying the benefits from our trade agreements in the future.